Good afternoon, everybody. We'll give it just a minute or so while I take attendance for people to sign on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okie dokie. So a couple things, just in terms of what is coming up. So I actually virtually attended a conference this weekend, so I didn't get much chance to grade. I'm going to try to catch up on that in the next couple days. But in terms of what is coming up next Thursday, your midterm is due. And that's already posted on Blackboard. So make sure over the next couple of days you take a look at it so you can come with any questions. I'll try to remember to go over it on Thursday. If I don't, someone remind me. So today we're starting detecting deception. And it also we'll talk about profiling a little bit. And then we'll do criminal assessment next week. So your midterm report for your service learning project is due a week from today. If you don't have much to report, that's okay. Just turn in what's going on. Like, I'm still trying to get set up with my site. That's fine. Just turn in something so I can give you a TI. I think I'm doing 5 points or something like that for that. If you have backlogged assignments in terms of the paper, make sure that you're catching up on them. If you have missed class when we've done an in-class assignment, please feel free to email me and I will share that with you, and you can answer the questions on your own and still get credit for it. So those are the big things coming up. And then the interview paper is due in several weeks on a Tuesday. So you have a little under a month for that. And I will get back to you on their interview questions soon, I promise. That's the first thing I'm going to grade, so you all have feedback and you can do your interviews. I think if there's anything else I want to say, I don't think so. Continue to reach out to me if anything is getting in the way of you being able to get your work done. And especially this semester, I am all about just helping you all do what you need to do in order to get the best fruit you can. So, again, if you need to turn things in late, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, or just turn them in late on Blackboard. That's fine. I'll grade them whenever you turn them in. And also, big kudos. This is the first time in a while. Everybody's here. So awesome. Welcome, everyone. So today we are going to be doing talking about profiling. Oh, and I did wear my Rorschach dress today, so you guys can finally see it. It's got all the ink blots on it. So today we're going to be talking about profiling first, and then we'll also be talking about some other stuff. Oh, thanks, Kenzie. And I discovered this over the weekend at the conference I presented at, because it was the Association for Women in Psychology. So it's a very inclusive conference, which is awesome. So I found out, oh yes, I can send you the link real quick. It's a great company that I get a lot of my sciencey stuff from. And let me find this dress in particular. It's new, so it should still exist.
Thank you.
So the website is called Svaha, S-V-A-H-A, and they have a lot of really cool science-themed stuff. So I have a neuron dress from them. I have a dress that has Rosalind Franklin's DNA crystallography on it. And I've gotten Quinn some cute stuff from there too. They do kid stuff. So, and I also, they're pricey, but if you catch them on a sale, you can get good deals. Like I think this was half off when I bought it. So definitely there are some really cool companies out there that make science-y stuff that you could use. Alrighty, so here is what I discovered at my conference. Ooh, let me get back to the section I want to be at, is that if you present in Google Slides, which I'm getting set up now. You can actually turn on closed captions. So India, you'll actually be able to follow me better, hopefully, than anyone else who is having Wi-Fi issues or anything like that. So I was really excited to find that out. So I plan to, for this class in particular, but any other class where people are having a hard time hearing me, seeing me, to just put all my PowerPoints in Google Slides so that I can do this. So this is something any of you can do if you're presenting in Google Slides and you want to be inclusive, is just when you're going to Google Slides, it'll give you all these options and you just click on CC for captions and it'll do it automatically. And it's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good because it uses the same one that Google developed that they use on YouTube and whatnot. So I'm super excited to be more accessible for folks in general, but particularly for folks who might struggle in particular. So, alrighty. So again, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about profiling and detecting deception. I know, right? I first figured that out a little late, a little slow, but that's okay. Let me see if even my clicker works with it. Score. So profiling is one of the things that a lot of people who take this class or are interested in the intersection of psych and the law, or just psych and the law, there we go, don't need anything else after that, are interested in doing. So I am going to talk about that. But at another point, we'll kind of talk about some of the issues related to profiling that make it a little hard to get into this line of work. So I just want to be upfront and say this is a nice intersection of the two, but it can also be pretty difficult to get a job just because there aren't that many. Most police departments don't have their own profiler. You know, there's a couple of these jobs in the federal government, etc. So behavioral scientists and police use, gosh, I keep doing this. I did this morning too, where like you guys can see the ceiling, but not me. Hey, that's better. All right. So behavioral scientists and police use criminal profiling to narrow criminal investigations to suspects who possess certain behavioral and personality features. And we get that information from the crime and the way it was committed. So, you know, clues that are left at the scene, the meticulous way things were done. So if we think about the episode of Dexter we watched, you know, how the other serial killer was cutting up the bodies, right? Those can tell us things about them. Most profiling has been for those who commit bizarre or repeated crimes against serial killers, serial rapists, serial arsonists, people who commit sexual homicides, and then also mass murderers. The difference, if you are not sure, between mass murder and serial murder is mass murder, it would happen all at once, a bunch of people all in one sitting. whereas serial would be over time, sort of one at a time usually. So the mass shootings that we see, those are usually, those would be classified as mass murder, if that makes sense. So things like school shootings, mall shootings, that type of thing. Profilers have interviewed those who have committed a specific type of offense in order to learn how they select and approach their victims. So this would sort of be like, for those of you who have seen Silence of the Lambs, how Jodie Foster's character goes and talks to Anthony Hopkins' character who's locked up because there's another serial killer who's doing things in a really weird way, right? And so she's like, what insight can I get from this guy who did something similar? And they ask them about how they select and approach their victims, how they react to crimes, what demographic or family characteristics they share, and what personality features might be predominant among them. So, it might be psychopathy, right? Or it might be some other things that we're, not even sure about. So how do we look at these homicide offenders? Again, looking at mass versus serial murders. So historically, most homicides are committed by killers who are well acquainted with their victim. They typically this will be their only victim. They typically have a motive that is rational to them, right? Whether it's betrayal, what have you, right? And then they kill once, and then they're usually arrested, right? Because you usually look to the people who know them best to go from there. So that is typically, even today, what we see in terms of most people who kill someone know them and might only kill one or two people. Or it might be like a murder-suicide, that type of thing. In the past 2 or 3 decades, increased attention has been paid to patterns of homicide involving killers who attack multiple victims. And sometimes these have really irrational, there we go, or bizarre motives. And they're much less likely to be apprehended than in former days. So for example, we still don't know who the Zodiac killer is, right? Like they just cracked one of his codes recently. And the reason it took them so long to crack is because he had typos in it, right? So it took a minute to figure that out. But we still don't know who that was. So multiple homicides are defined by Fox and Levin as the slaying of 4 or more victims simultaneously or sequentially by one or a few individuals. So sometimes it's like a pair of people who are committing these homicides together. And then the 2 main types here, again, are mass murders and serial murders. And the mass murderer kills 4 or more victims in one location during a short period of time, so maybe just a few minutes or maybe several hours. In almost 80% of mass murders, the assailant knew at least one of the victims, and usually it is a very carefully planned assault. So again, if we think about things like school shootings, often we find plans left over from what those folks were doing, right? The typical assailant is killed at the location of the crime, dies by suicide, or surrenders to police. So again, isolated incident, a lot of death all at once, especially if they're using something like a semi-automatic weapon. And, they're arrested because they're still on the scene of the crime, or again, their death is part of that incident. Serial murderers kill 4 or more victims each on separate occasions. Serial killers usually select a certain type of victim. So again, using Dexter as an example, he was killing criminals, right? Other people would choose people who are a certain like age, sex, things like that. And they're usually strangers for serial murderers. And they that victim somehow fulfills a role in the killer's fantasies. These are usually very carefully planned, and serial murderers are very difficult to apprehend because they can seem to be normal community members, right? These can seem like just your average guy or girl, although most serial killers, and I think almost all mass murderers, are male. I think that has to do something with the toxic masculinity and et cetera in our society, but that's kind of tangential, not that tangential, but anyway. They can just seem like normal guys, partially because many of them are psychopaths, right? Many of them would meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder. And one of the symptoms of that is, being able to put on a mask and seem like a normal person and be smarmy. So in terms of motives for serial and mass murder, again, Fox and Levin, they do a lot of work in this area. They have provided examples of power, revenge, loyalty, profit, or terror. So I'll say those again. In terms of the motives for either serial or mass murder, so power, feeling like you have power over your victim, feeling like you have power over people who can't figure out who you are. Revenge, getting back at someone. So we've had a couple incidents of mass murder where someone goes back to like a workplace where they were fired. Loyalty, some sort of misguided idea about someone cheating on them or doing it in the name of religion. Profit, so people who are contract killers, right? They're few and far between, but they exist. And terror, so particularly mass murders are often terrorist events, right? And their whole goal is to instill fear and sort of try to disrupt things and pull people apart. So in terms of how do we actually address criminal profiling, how do we go about doing it? Well, the first thing they do is look at profiling inputs. So the profiler collects all the information available about that crime. Information from the scene, information from other aspects of it, information from, the victim if they're still alive, information from, witnesses, although again, you saw last week that, eyewitnesses might not be the most reliable people, but, still you can get some sort of information there, right? And then you use what are called decision process models. And these are just ways that you organize all that information you have about the person who committed the crime. Again, that you're deducing from all these secondary sources, because if you knew who the person was, right, you wouldn't have to do a profile on them until you try to find them. In terms of crime assessment, on the basis of the findings in step 2, the profiler will attempt to reconstruct the behavior of the offender and the victim. So what happened in that scenario? How did they get to this place, essentially? And then criminal profile, they'll start to formulate an initial description of the most likely suspects. This is the type of person it would be, such as, it's maybe a single male between 30 and 50 who's probably working alone, right? An investigation, so you give a written report to the investigators who then concentrate on suspects that match that profile that you have devised. And then apprehension, so you arrest a suspect, and that allows the profiler to evaluate whether or not their profile was accurate. And give me just 1 second here. I just realized that I used to have another piece of paper in this folder, and my daughter loves to go through and pull out all my notes and random handouts. So I need to just pull up my notes about criticisms of profiling, so I make sure I have all the info. Here it is. And I will actually just print myself another copy while I'm thinking about it too. But I can use it off the screen. All right, so here are some of the limitations of profiling, and you'll hear my printer in the background. So it's very potentially helpful, and there have been many cases where it was helpful in identifying a perpetrator. I'm going to grab my notes so I don't have to look at the screen that you guys are not on. Ta-da! All right, it has many limitations. So the biggest example here is the DC sniper case. So I don't know if you all remember this. This is maybe what, like 10 years ago. There was just in DC and the surrounding areas, people were just getting killed by snipers, which, if you have any familiarity with snipers, means that the bullet just comes out of the blue. So people were terrified to leave their homes because this was happening. So FBI psychologists who were profilers said that this was a guy who was acting alone, but in fact it was a pair of people. It was John Allen Muhammad and John Lee Malvo. They said it was a young thrill seeker. Muhammad was actually 41, and the motive was not thrill seeking. His motive was political ideology. So as long as investigators are aware of the limitations of profilers, they can be helpful. But we also need to be cautious about knowing that, like, this is essentially a hypothesis, right? This is an assumption we make because we only have so much information that we can look at when we are, creating these profiles. So as long as you recognize that, that's fine, because then you can overcome confirmation bias, which is when you have a profile in front of you, you look for someone who matches that profile, and you might ignore people who don't match it. And so it's really important to take a profile as a guideline and not necessarily as the end all be all. Inaccurate profiles are actually quite common. And most of the research in the past has been done in-house by the FBI, which suggests there might be some bias, right? If you are doing research on your own profilers, right, that means that you lose that lens of objectivity. Another question that needs to be answered is, can it be substantiated? The concepts and approaches actually used by profilers are often not objectively and systematically defined. And some argue that it lacks scientific support necessary to testify in court as a result. So if we think about all those standards of deciding whether you can present expert testimony, right? Does this meet that? Maybe not. So in a 1996 study, 70% of police psychologists actually questioned the validity of profiling. So can these characteristics in offender profiles be based on substantive arguments which support or refute various inferred claims about the offender? I mean, this gets tricky, right? And the less information you have, the more you have to extrapolate. Of the nearly 4,000 claims studied by criminal profilers, nearly 80% were unsubstantiated, were never substantiated. That is, they contain no grounds, warrant, backing, or rebuttal. Moreover, less than 31% of the claims were falsifiable, and only 25% of statements in profiles written by profilers were inferences about the offender's characteristics. So, in a meta-analysis published in 2007, so if you're not familiar with what a meta-analysis is, it's where you look at all the studies published on a topic and you essentially combine all their data to look at overall trends. And in this meta-analysis published by Snook et al. In 2007, it said that the predictive ability of criminal profiling is actually lacking. So our ability to actually predict who the suspect will be based on a profile is not great. So possibly the most damaging conclusion in their analysis of predictive accuracy was that experienced profilers, they looked at experienced profilers, so a lot of studies will do this, have experienced profilers, look at some facts, come up with a profile, predict who it'll be. And then they do the same thing with college students. So like when you all participate in the Psych 480 studies, or you participate in some of the studies conducted by the psych department faculty, then, these would be those type of folks. And they found that when they compared those, the people who have experienced profiling might be working for the FBI, and the people who are just folks like you, college students, there's no statistical difference in predicting behavior between the two groups. To me, that's like the most damning piece of fact, right? Most damning finding is that, if there's no difference in predicting ability between so-called professionals and unprofessionals, non-professionals, it would seem that all probate value is lost. The meta-analysis, however, did show that professional profilers were slightly better at predicting overall offender characteristics, but this is to be expected, as this is the profiler's supposed area of expertise. They should be much more familiar with criminal profiling literature, which would provide them with a wider range of options, ideas, and hypotheses. So if criminal profiling is greater than chance, there should be a statistically significant difference between the two groups. And at least in this case, when they combined all the data, there was not. So again, I hate to knock down people's dreams, right? So I know a lot of people do want to be profilers, but I just raise this because I think it's important to consider, is there science behind what we're doing? And if there's not, why are we doing it, right? Are there more helpful things we could be doing and putting our resources towards those? And so on Thursday, we'll actually watch an episode of the show Lie to Me, which uses psychological science to get at detecting deception and predicting things. And this is a real thing that you can do, is looking at micro expressions. But that's not the end all be all either, right? We got to come up with better ways to do this, is essentially what this says. And maybe that's something you all will do in the future. All right. So part of what we want to look at today too is evaluating confessions, because these become a big part of not only criminal cases, but just deciding who might go up for a criminal case, who might be considered, who might not be considered. And so one of the best known Supreme Court cases is Miranda v. Arizona from 1966. And this dealt with the problem of coerced confessions. So confessions that are made under duress, you kind of pull them out of people. And we know when that happens, they are much less likely to be accurate. So for example, from all of the interrogations that they did at Guantanamo, there was very little accurate information from those. Because when someone's being, say, waterboarded, they're just going to say anything to get you to stop doing it, right? So that's a big piece of this, and why we want to be really cautious about coerced confessions. So as a result of the Miranda decision, police must warn suspects of certain rights before starting a custodial interrogation. And this is the Miranda rights that we all know from TV and movies. If procedures are not followed, any damaging admissions made by suspects cannot be used in the prosecution in a trial. So this is why it's very important that law enforcement follow protocols and that they ensure that the Miranda rights are read, et cetera, et cetera. And most countries have some version of this, and their rights might be slightly different, but most places now have these sort of rating of rights and also certain procedures that you follow for things. So in the Colorado versus Connolly case in 1986, it said that those who are young or developmentally disabled or have developmental delays are especially vulnerable to the tactics of a skillful interrogator. Though the Supreme Court has stated that a suspect's mental limitations or psychological problems do not necessarily lead to the conclusion that the confession was involuntary. So, this doesn't say that, all confessions from kids or from people with developmental delays you throw out the window. It just means you need to be that much more careful when eliciting those confessions. The U.S. Supreme Court has weakened the Miranda requirements in several cases. Got to talk about Jackson versus Deno first. So the Supreme Court in Jackson versus Deno, which was 1964, held that criminal defendants are entitled to a pre-trial hearing that determines whether the confession they made was given voluntarily. Only if the judge determines that the confession was made voluntarily can it be introduced during the trial. So this would be a separate hearing to say, yes or no, we can use this confession. Just gonna turn on my fan because it starts to bake a little bit up here in the afternoon. All right, so now we could talk about the way that these things are walked back. And so Miranda faced a major challenge in 2000. The Supreme Court reaffirmed Miranda in Dickerson versus the United States. And this is a good example of stare decisis, and pardon my Latin because I never took it. But the court's preference for maintaining stability in its decisions whenever possible. So keeping the continuity of those decisions. But there are places where it has been weakened. So in Harris versus New York in 71, it said that confessions that violate Miranda may still be used in a trial. Again, it has to be decided. In Fair versus Michael C. in 79, confessions by defendant who don't fully understand the warnings may still be used. And then Berkemer versus McCarty in 1984 says Miranda doesn't apply unless the suspect is in police custody. So if the suspect just starts like talking at the scene, right? Like you can read the Miranda rights, but if they just keep talking, you can use that, right? Anything you say or do can be used against you in the court of law. And then in Rhode Island versus Innis in 1980, Miranda doesn't apply unless the defendant is actually being interrogated. So it kind of goes along with the previous one, right? If the person just starts talking and just says stuff and you don't even have to interrogate them, right? Then Miranda doesn't technically apply. All right, so looking at confessions, let's look at the evidence, the validity of it. So there are two kinds of erroneous outcomes possible. False negatives, where you decide this person didn't do the crime when they did, right? And false positives, where you decide this person did the crime, but they didn't. Both are problematic, right? False negatives means the criminal could end up back on the street and reoffend. False positive means that, like Ron Cotton, right, in the film we watched last week, the 60 Minutes episode, you could end up imprisoned for something you didn't actually do. So approximately 250 false confessions have been documented. That doesn't mean there aren't more, right? But those ones have been documented since the time of Miranda. And in 2005, Casson noticed that 25% of the people who were exonerated by DNA evidence after serving time in prison had falsely confessed. And I think for our last chapter, I wrote this down. No, I didn't write down the updated stat on that. But certainly if you look at the Innocence Project website, they do have that stat. I remember seeing it. I'm just not remembering what it was off the top of my head, the updated version of that. How do you also prove a confession is false? So the person comes in, they tell you something, and technically you should take it at face value, right? But what if that person's lying? How do you figure that out? So there are 4 ways in which we can be certain that a disputed confession is actually false. One could be the suspect confesses to a crime that never happens. You might be like, what? But, maybe the suspect confesses to a robbery they thought was going to happen and it went awry, and so nothing was ever stolen. Or they confess to a murder, but the person doesn't die, right? Things along those lines. 2 is if it was physically impossible for the suspect to commit the crime. right? So if this is something where the knife clearly came from above, and this suspect is paralyzed from the waist down and can't stand up, right? Yeah, if they make a confession that they did it, we start to say, okay, right? 3 is that the actual perpetrator is identified with guilt objectively established, right? Oh, this other guy actually did it. And then 4 is that there might be evidence like DNA that definitively establishes the defendant's innocence. And so you might be wondering, like, why would someone give a false confession? Well, we're going to get to this on our next slide. So part of it has to do with the interrogation techniques that are used. So these are common techniques. It doesn't mean that in every interview these will be used. But the pre-interrogation is softening up the subject or the suspect. So when a suspect arrives at the police station for questioning, the police begin to subtly exert pressure on him or her to talk. They may soften them up by using flattery or ingratiation and rapport building, or so they might bring them something to eat or drink. They might ask benign questions and engage in pleasant small talk just to get the person more comfortable. During the interrogation itself, the police will use negative incentives. So accusations, sometimes they'll use evidence fabrications and attacks on the subject's denials to break down a suspect's defenses, to lower their resistance, and instill feelings of fear, despair, and powerlessness. The police can also use positive inducements to motivate the suspect to see that an admission is in his or her or their best interest. So you'll get a lighter sentence if you tell us this. You know, we'll put you up for a lighter crime, things along those lines. So people have looked at interrogation techniques empirically with research, and they found that overall police are good at obtaining Miranda waivers from suspects by establishing rapport. So you can get people to waive their right to the attorney. Again, part of Miranda is you have a right to the attorney, right? But the police can be like, oh, you don't need an attorney, right? You can just talk to me. It's not good. If you're ever in a situation, I hope none of you are, but if you're ever in a situation where you are arrested, say, I want a lawyer. And then they can't interrogate you until a lawyer comes. So if you have one, great, you call them. If not, someone will be provided for you, typically a public defender. Also, people who lack experience in the criminal justice system and those who are innocent are more likely to waive their rights and submit to questioning. Well, I'm innocent, so I don't need anybody else here. That's going to make it look like I'm guilty. Now it's going to make it look like you're smart, right? The detective's presumption of guilt, because that's why you're in there, right? That's why they're trying to get you to confess, is they are assuming you're the one who did this. So that presumption of guilt seems to lead to a process of behavioral confirmation. The expectations of the interrogators affect their questioning style. It also can subsequently affect the suspect's behavior and ultimately judgments of the suspect's guilt. So essentially, because that person believes you did it, you start acting in a way that seems guilty. Maybe mostly because you're anxious about it, right? Many juveniles in particular have difficulty understanding the rights afforded to them by the Miranda warnings. And defendants aged 15 and younger are willing to waive their rights and even plead guilty when the evidence against them is not as strong. Of the 125 proven false confession cases looked at in 2004 by Drizzen and Leo, 33%, a full third, involved juveniles. So that's a third of these people with false confessions are under 18, right? And going to juvie or sometimes being tried as an adult because they falsely confessed, because they were essentially coerced into it. The clearest example of this I've ever seen is if anyone's watched Making a Murderer. There is a young man who I think is like a teenager who clearly has a developmental delay. He's not very bright. And they get him to confess to things that never happened just because they keep asking about it. Now, in terms of false confession, Hassan and Reitzman, yes, the Reitzman who was the original author of your textbook, devised a taxonomy to describe different kinds of false confessions. So the first one is voluntary. The person just automatically does it. Maybe they're trying to protect somebody else, right? They know who did it and they're trying to protect them, etc. The compliant false confession is where the suspect complies with the interrogator's demands to make an incriminating statement, all the while knowing he or she is innocent. So they essentially succumb to these suggestions by the interrogator. And one thing I'll say is that in the vast majority of cases, the officers aren't trying to falsely accuse someone. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. It certainly can. It's just tactics are used that they think are going to bring out accurate information, and in fact, they just elicit people to confess. And then there's internalized false confession, which is as a result of a manipulative interrogation. Suspects confess because they come to believe they must have committed the crime. And that sounds crazy, but if anyone's ever seen the video of the Asch conformity experiment, you might have seen this in intro psych, or if you took Dr. Jackson's social psych class. So what happened there is they had one participant come in. They thought there were a bunch of other participants in the room, but they were all research assistants. And they showed them pictures with lines, and it was really obvious which two were the same. But they had the research assistants say the wrong line. So like a line this long, they were saying it matched up to a line this long. And what they found is that the participants just start going along with it. Like, yeah, that line that's double the length is the same length because everybody else was saying it. So then maybe I'm missing something. The human mind is pretty malleable. We're not perfect. Yeah, the Asch experiment is very cool and shows how easy it is to manipulate people. Even, these were college students that are pretty smart, right? So partially because we are pack animals, humans are, we tend to want to please other humans. So that can happen for sure. All right, so that happens. Now we're up to evaluation of confessions in courtroom. So if we have this separate trial to try to look at, can this confession be used? In the cases of a disputed confession, judges almost always decide that confessions are voluntary and thus admissible. So this is sort of a confirmation bias, or just sort of thought that they all are, so we'll just keep saying they are. And not surprisingly, jurors are very influenced by confessions. If someone says, I did it, the jurors are like, why would they say they did it if they didn't do it? So of course they did it, right? Jurors are highly likely to convict defendants who have confessed, even when that confession is false. So cases in which false confessors pled not guilty and proceeded to trial. So they made a false confession. When it came time to plead, they said, I'm not guilty. That was coerced out of me. In those cases, jury conviction rates range from 73% to 81%. So even when the person is saying, that confession isn't right, I am not guilty, jurors are like, but you confessed. And so they tend to convict. Jurors fail to discount a confession elicited by high-pressure tactics of interrogators. And this is called the fundamental attribution error. Again, this is something you probably learned if you took Dr. Jackson's class, or we talk about in other classes like theories of personality or intro. And so the basic idea behind the fundamental attribution error is you believe if someone else messes up, it's because something wrong with them. But if you mess up, it's because of something wrong with the environment or someone else. And the clearest, silliest example I always give of the fundamental attribution error is, let's say you watch someone trip on campus and you're like, what a klutz, right? Like, that person's just always clumsy. You have no other evidence for this, right? But it's about that person. And then if you trip, you'd be like, who put that curb there, right? So you're going to blame it on something else. Same thing can happen with a jury, where they don't see the external situation as a determinant of behavior. Like, that person confessed, therefore they're wrong. Like, I wouldn't give a false confession under those circumstances. And if it happened to me, it'd be the police's fault, right? But that person confessed. So they did it. And people are generally not very adept at distinguishing true from false confessions, which again makes this even more dangerous. Okay, so what can we do to try to prevent false confession? Because we've seen this domino effect of what happens if there's a false confession, right? If it's admitted, which is majority of the time is going to be, then the jury is going to convict. And now you've got someone who didn't do it going to prison because they had a false confession. So recording all police interrogations can provide a complete, objective, and reviewable record of how the suspect was questioned. So this may just be audio recording. A lot of times now it's video recording. And typically the officers or whoever, the agents, detectives, whoever who's questioning will let the person know. And they'll even say on the recording, this is the interrogation of so-and-so, this time on this day by, detective so-and-so and detective so-and-so. So recording can help halt manipulative tactics by investigators, and it can also help halt frivolous claims of coercion by defendants because it's all there on tape. So this is back to what's sometimes called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. This is a principle in physics where the idea is you can't study something without changing it. It goes back to electrons and atoms. You can either know how fast they're going or where they are. You can't know both. And this applies to other sciences. So in this case, it's like, if you know you're being watched, just the act of being watched is going to change things. So like in psychology, if we have people start to record things like, their activity level, they'll immediately start changing it because they know they're being watched, right? And they also start to realize things themselves. So that can be really helpful. And then obviously, if there is coercion, then that officer is just not very bright, right? Because that was on recording. And maybe they shouldn't be a police officer. I don't know. And then more than half of all law enforcement agencies now record at least some of their interrogations. And there are a handful of states that mandate videotaping or, digital file recording with video. And there are probably still some places that use the old-fashioned videotapes, but I'm hoping most places have had the funds to upgrade now. But certainly there are many police departments that are underfunded. Note that when the camera is focused on the suspect, observers are more likely to judge the confession as voluntary. But if you record the same confession with a different camera, maybe one that shows both of the folks in the room, then you're less likely to say, oh yeah, they just said this of their own free will. So really interesting to kind of consider the perspective of the camera as part of that. So Lassiter, who is a psychologist who does a lot of work in this area, a lot of research, recommends an equal focus perspective. So essentially you would see the whole room, you see both the interrogator and the interrogatee, both on camera. And that allows observers to view both of them, both the interrogator and the suspect. And thus it can reduce bias inherent in, again, viewing video of just one of them. So that's really important as well. Okay, so let's say you do have an uncoerced confession. You're talking to the person and they're freely talking to you. How can you tell if they're lying to you? This also becomes important because we know that people who are in situations where they are being questioned or asked to give a confession have a lot of motivation not to tell the truth, right? Like they don't want to end up in prison. They don't want to have to go through this trial process, right? How accurately can we detect deception? Well, a 2006 study by Bond and DiPaolo determined that people are only correct about 54% of the time, which is hardly more than chance, right? That's almost a flip of a coin. People generally have a truth bias, a bias towards judging statements as being truthful, which of course kind of comes into bite us when we are looking at coerced confessions, right? Because you assume if someone said it, it's true. And people who have experience judging deceit are typically no better at it than those with no experience. Although those with experience are less likely to have that truth bias. So similar to the profiling research, we're finding that training isn't super helpful here. But it depends on the type of training, right? If you just have general ideas about it, maybe not that helpful. If you're getting very specific training, like again, when we watch Lie to Me on Thursday, that really improves your ability to detect deception. So people often have mistaken beliefs about verbal and nonverbal cues related to deception. So for example, we tend to think if someone's not looking you in the eye, if they're avoiding eye contact, that means that they're lying. But in fact, that's not generally a sign of deception. It could be that they are embarrassed, anxious, whatever, so they're looking down. Or sometimes when we think about something, right, we just kind of like, well, when we're seriously taking a thought and thinking about it. So it can, happen that someone is telling the truth, but they look away because they're really trying to remember it. And it helps us to pull things out of our memory if we're not distracted by other things in our visual field. It's like when you are following your GPS, right? Your Google Maps or Apple Maps, what have you, and you're getting close to the place and you turn down the radio. People have had that experience, I'm guessing. That's because you're trying to concentrate all of your attention on the directions and on looking for that place. So you try to get rid of distractions. So there are very few reliable nonverbal cues of deception, especially obvious ones. Again, we'll see with Lie to Me, these micro expressions are more reliable, but much, much harder to detect. You need a lot of training to do so. And this is perhaps because people who are asked to tell the truth also show signs of nervousness, right? So if you're in a situation where you're in a police station and being interrogated, most people who are not people with antisocial personality disorder are going to be anxious about that, right? Psychologists have had more success determining which verbal cues can reliably predict deceptive behavior. So things like a large amount of reported detail. So if you're able to give a really rich description of an event, that's typically indicative of a truthful report because it's harder to make up all that detail. Truth tellers are also more likely than liars to say they can't recall certain things. Liars will try to fill in the blanks. Liars also tend to speak in higher pitched voices and make more speech errors like slips of the tongue than do truth tellers. Cognitive load interviews can enhance our ability to tell truth tellers from liars. So these mentally tax a person to the point that it becomes difficult to simultaneously answer a question and maintain a lie. So I think you'll see this in the Lie to Me episode. I'm trying to remember if this was in the first episode or the second episode of that show. But there's a case where they are interrogating someone and they ask them to recount the events backwards. So if you've actually lived the events, that's not easy, but it's, you could still do it, right? Like, so instead of being like, this morning I woke up and then I, got Quinn and we watched some videos about ocean wildlife on the bed before we went downstairs and ate breakfast. Because I just told the truth, I can say, well, before we ate breakfast, we were upstairs chilling and watching some videos of sea life, and I got her up and, you know, things like that. If you made stuff up, it's harder to do that because you don't have that actual autobiographical memory to refer to. So again, it becomes simultaneously difficult to answer a question while also maintaining a lie. So those can be really helpful. There's a lot of good research with that. So what about lie detectors? What about the polygraph? So the polygraph was developed around 1917 by William Marston, and he claimed that he could detect lying by noting increases in subjects' blood pressure when they lied. Problem with this is, again, there's lots of reasons why our blood pressure can go up. We can be stressed. We could have just eaten too much salt, right? We could have just exercised, things along those lines. In the 1930s, John Larson built a forerunner of the modern polygraph that could measure pulse rate, blood pressure, and respiratory changes during an interview. So we're getting more data. The problem with the polygraph is that the physiological manifestations of various negative emotions like fear, guilt, anger are all very, very similar. Simply being suspected of committing a crime, even if you're innocent, may generate a lot of emotion that should not be seen as guilt. And again, kind of a fun example of this is the movie Ocean's 13. So they have like their nerdy tech guy get a job at the casino, and they know he's going to flunk the polygraph. So they put a tack in his shoe, and anytime he answers a question, he steps on it, even if he's asking, like, what's your name? So there's no way they can tell when he's lying because he's just reacting to the pain every time. And the guy even says, like, are you okay? You see, you're spiking on everything. And he's just like, I just really want this job, right? So certainly just because you see a reaction on a polygraph doesn't mean that's because the person is lying. There are different techniques you can use with the polygraph. So the control question test, or CQT, includes relevant questions, which inquire about the crime under investigation, and comparison questions, which are calculated to induce an emotional reaction because they cover common misdeeds. So before the age of 21, did you ever try to hurt someone you disliked, right? Pretty much everyone with siblings would say yes to this, right? And a lot of other kids would too. The expectation is that guilty subjects should be more aroused by the relevant questions to which they must respond with a lie in order to maintain their innocence, whereas innocent subjects should be more aroused by the comparison questions because they worry that admitting to a past misdeed might make them look more like a criminal. Another technique is the guilty knowledge test, or the GKT. And the goal here is to detect the presence of guilty knowledge in the suspect's mind rather than lying. So the person administering the polygraph, sometimes called the polygrapher, presents a series of multiple choice questions. Each alternative would seem equally plausible to an innocent person. But the true criminal will, in theory, be revealed by their heightened physiological reactions that accompany the recognition of the answers that fit with the actual crime, the recognition of guilty knowledge, as they term it. So how valid is the polygraph? The test can't distinguish emotions such as fear, anger, nervousness, and excitement. So it can tell you, yeah, this person had an emotional reaction, but not necessarily what that emotional reaction actually means. In addition, questioning methods are not standardized. There's not like a standard way you say the questions. There's not a standard way you go about the procedure. Deceptive subjects can be trained to beat the test by taking countermeasures such as relaxation or meditation so that they don't get any spikes. And all this could lead to negative errors, believing that a liar is truthful, a false negative, or believing that a truthful subject is lying, a false positive. Overall accuracy rates only about 65%, maybe a little better. So are these admissible in court then? In about half of the states, a defendant takes a polygraph test with the understanding that the prosecutor will drop charges if the defendant passes the test, but may use the results in court if the defendant does not pass. The other way in which polygraph evidence is admitted is when a defendant has passed a polygraph exam and tries to have that evidence considered in an ongoing investigation. In states that permit polygraph evidence to be used in trials, judges conduct pre-trial hearings to determine whether polygraph results are admissible in particular cases according to the standards of admissibility established in the Daubert versus Merrill Dow pharmaceutical case in 1993 that we have talked about before. So basically they're not great, but you can get some good information from them. So my friend that is a police officer that I've talked about before, he talked about talking to the polygrapher, and the guy said he'll learn a lot when he's hooking people up. So like when he's hooking people up, they'll say things like, "You're not going to ask me about this, are you?" Or, "I'm glad I'm not getting drug tested today." And so the guy takes notes on all that, right? So I think sometimes it can almost be like a Rorschach, where you get information from someone because they expect it to get information, if that makes sense. All right, so what about looking at the brain? Right, we're getting better and better with brain scans. Can we start to use those to detect deception? So functional magnetic resonance imaging, also known as fMRI, measures blood flow and oxygen usage in selected parts of the brain. And different patterns of brain activity have been found to be associated with truth-telling and lying. The accuracy of this method could range from 76% to 90%. Brain wave analysis, or also called brain fingerprinting, uses EEG, which is like an EKG, but for your brain. So just electrical activity. You don't see where in the brain things are happening. And it's basically recording the brain's electrical activity. A unique brainwave pattern, the P300. You wouldn't even keep it right on the closed captions. I'm impressed, Google. All right, so the P300 brainwave is elicited by a stimulus that is meaningful to the suspect. A guilty person, but not an innocent subject, would react differently to the critical details of the crime scene because they are meaningful. 85% to 95% accuracy in distinguishing liars from truth tellers in a lab. However, once you move it out to the field and you've got actual criminals and not just someone like pretending to know about a crime, it drops to about 50-50, again, a coin flip. So the problem becomes these things are really pricey to do, especially fMRIs. They can cost like hundreds of dollars an hour or thousands of dollars an hour, depending on where you are to do, right? So it's just not practical to do them, especially when the science is so young. I went to a talk at APA probably like 8 years ago about this, and Scott Lilienfeld, who actually recently passed away, rest in peace. He was a very big name in psychology. But he talked about this info and like, are we just going to start doing this? And he was basically like, no, like the science isn't there yet. Maybe we'll get there, but most of these studies have very small sample sizes. So the results can really vary widely from one study to another. So can you use this in court? Defendants and witnesses may try to introduce the results of these tests to demonstrate their innocence or bolster their credibility. Judges must determine whether the testimony meets that Daubert standard for admissibility of scientific evidence. So when the police capture suspects, one of their first acts is to try to encourage a confession, and that confession allows a district attorney or a grand jury to bring charges, and this is beyond just brain-based stuff. This is everything in general. And then a confession, again, perverts the district attorney to or a grand jury to bring charges. And even if the suspect later recants, the confession can be introduced during the trial. And again, these confessions can be coerced, which is obviously problematic. So our slide here, this was something that came out in 2010, which I believe is the first time I taught this class here at Wesleyan. So I was really excited to see this and to include that information. Obviously, it's about 10 years out of date now, but I thought it was really interesting. So what do lie detection methods have in common? Oh, and the article, just so you know, was titled Pitfalls and Opportunities in Verbal and Nonverbal Lie Detection. So what do all these lie detection methods have in common? So there's the assumption that liars may experience stronger emotions. Liars may experience higher levels of cognitive load, which is why we do those cognitive load interval interviews. And then liars are inclined to use more and different strategies to make convincing impression on others. There are obviously problems with that. So experiencing emotions is not the sole domain of liars, right? We all experience them, although, again, maybe not people with antisocial personality disorder to the same extent. There's also something called the ostrich effect, that people sometimes don't actually attempt to uncover the truth. Fabrication can be more tolerable and pleasant. Ignorance can be preferred. Again, if police are they already decided this is the person that did it, they don't really care about the truth sometimes, unfortunately. There's also no single cue like Pinocchio's nose growing that people will constantly rely on for lie detection. And the differences between people who lie and don't lie can be very small. And liars often deliberately attempt to appear credible by taking those countermeasures. Liars will also embed lies in truths. For example, if you ask someone, where were you last Tuesday? They'll tell you what they did last Monday. So it's something that happened to them. So it's true, it just didn't happen on that day. We also don't give feedback. People aren't going to be like, guess what, I lied, right, after a polygraph. So we can't make the distinctions and learn from our mistakes. And there are just people who are really good liars, right? And so that can throw a wrench in this. Some common errors that are made by folks in lie detection, examining the wrong cues. So again, looking at things like gaze aversion and fidgeting, which are not reliable cues to detection. We do that because of moral reasoning. We think, well, lying is wrong. And people look away when they're ashamed, so they must be doing that when they're lying. And then these persist as illusory correlations. The idea that we assume they're correct, so we use them. There's also an overemphasis on those nonverbal cues. Both verbal and nonverbal are actually really important. As we talked about earlier, sometimes the verbal would be more important. Sometimes the nonverbal are very accurate. So one study showed that observing only 5 seconds of behavior can result in reasonably reliable inference of psychopathy, for example, particularly by trained experts. And sometimes we don't even realize which nonverbal cues we're using. It's almost like a feeling we get. And it comes because it can be taxing, and individuals are trained to pick up on these cues. There's also something called the Othello error, which is where you too readily interpret certain behaviors, particularly signs of nervousness, as deception. Truth tellers can be just as nervous, as we've already talked about today. So this is from Othello, where Desdemona reacts really emotionally when she's accused, and Othello sees that as guilt, but in fact she's just really upset that he accused her, right? Heuristics or decision rules, we tend to rely on these, and they can be really inaccurate. Interview techniques can impair lie detection. So if you accuse someone of lying or hammer them, they tend to clam up, whether they're lying or not. And then overconfidence in our own lie detection skills, just like with eyewitnesses, competence does not equal correctness. So what should interrogators do? Pay attention to all cues, particularly those that have research backing. Pay attention to both verbal and nonverbal cues. Consider alternate explanations. Avoid that Othello error. What else could make the person act in this way? Take interpersonal and intrapersonal factors into account. Is this person reacting this way because they have a reaction? Let's say we are having a white officer interrogate a Black individual, right? Are they reacting this way because they're lying, or are they reacting this way because they have all of the evidence in their mind that this is not a good situation for them, that there is inherent bias within the system against people like them? Use an information gathering style interview, and this is much more effective than an accusatory style. You want to ask unanticipated questions, things the liar couldn't have memorized or prepared for. Ask them temporal questions, so where were you when? And then again, this cognitive load does seem to have some validity here. So lying is more cognitively demanding than truth-telling. So again, asking them to tell the story in reverse order, asking them to maintain eye contact, which can be harder because we often look away when we're thinking, and asking irrelevant questions. Again, just to sort of throw a wrench into things. Alrighty, so we got through the whole lecture today, which is good. Oh, hang on. So we'll start Thursday by watching the episode of Lie to Me, and then we will do a group assignment based on that. So y'all are free to go. Thanks for hanging in there with me. I know the lecture days are less interesting than the group activity days, but hopefully you got some interesting information out of this.
Oh, I did have a quick question.
Sure.